In a small-town courthouse, a black veteran stood tall, his dignity unshaken despite the chains on his wrists. Little did the bailiff know, the man's shaved head, forced upon him in a cruel act of humiliation, would mark the beginning of a reckoning. When a woman ascended to the judge's bench, the bailiff's smug grin vanished, his world unraveling in a single, frozen moment. Malcolm Reed, a man of 52, stood in the holding cell of the Jefferson County Courthouse, his shoulders squared despite the weight of the moment. He'd faced worse than this. 20 years in the Army, deployments in Iraq, and the kind of loss that hardened a man's resolve. His hair, his crown of tight curls, was gone now, shaved clean just hours earlier by bailiff Carl Grayson. The act wasn't just a procedural haircut. It was a power play, a message delivered with a sneer and the buzz of clippers. "You're nobody here," Grayson had said, his eyes glinting with something Malcolm had seen too often in his life: prejudice, raw and unmasked. Malcolm didn't flinch as the clippers ran over his scalp. He'd stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, refusing to give Grayson the satisfaction of a reaction. The other inmates in the holding area, a mix of young men caught in the system's churn, had gone quiet, sensing the violation in the air. Malcolm's hair fell to the floor in clumps, each curl a piece of his identity stripped away. But Malcolm's spirit? That was steel, forged in places Grayson could never touch. The morning had started routinely enough for Malcolm. He'd been arrested 2 days prior, pulled over for a traffic stop that spiraled into charges of resisting arrest. The officer claimed Malcolm had been belligerent, but the dashcam footage, yet to be reviewed, told a different story. A black man calm, hands raised, asking why he'd been stopped. The truth didn't matter in the moment. Malcolm was booked, processed, and sent to the county jail. Now he was due in court for his arraignment, a step toward either freedom or deeper entanglement in a system he knew wasn't built for men like him. Grayson, a burly man in his late 40s with a permanent scowl, had worked the courthouse for years. To him, the job was more than enforcing order. It was about control. He'd seen countless defendants pass through, most too beaten down to challenge his authority. But something about Malcolm Reed got under his skin. Maybe it was the way Malcolm carried himself, head high, eyes steady, like he knew his worth. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Malcolm's blackness, a quiet defiance in a town where Grayson's biases went unchecked. The haircut wasn't standard procedure. Grayson had claimed it was for hygiene, but the other inmates, most with hair untouched, knew better. It was a ritual of humiliation, one Grayson reserved for those he deemed needed breaking. He'd taken his time with Malcolm, dragging the clippers slowly, taunting him. "You military boys think you're tough, huh? Not in my house." Malcolm had said nothing, his silence louder than any protest could have been. Now, as Malcolm was led into the courtroom, the cold metal of handcuffs biting his wrists, he felt the weight of every eye in the room. The gallery was sparse, a few family members of other defendants, a board reporter from the local paper, and a couple of retirees who treated court hearings like free entertainment. The judge's bench loomed empty, the clock ticking toward 9 a.m. Grayson stood near the door, arms crossed, his smirk barely concealed. To him, Malcolm was just another case number, another black man to be processed and forgotten. But Malcolm wasn't alone in this fight, even if he didn't know it yet. Across town, Judge Evelyn Carter was preparing for her first day on the bench in Jefferson County. At 45, she was a rarity, a black woman judge in a region where the judiciary was overwhelmingly white and male. Her appointment had stirred whispers, some of pride, others of resentment. Evelyn had spent years as a public defender, fighting for clients like Malcolm, men and women chewed up by a system that saw them as problems, not people. She'd earned her robes through grit, outworking colleagues who coasted on privilege, and now she was here to deliver justice, not just rulings but fairness. Evelyn had heard about the case before stepping into the courtroom. A friend in the clerk's office had tipped her off about Malcolm Reed, a veteran with no prior record, caught in a questionable arrest. The clerk hadn't mentioned the haircut, though Grayson's act was too fresh, too brazen to have reached her ears. As Evelyn adjusted her robes in her chambers, She felt the familiar weight of responsibility. She knew the eyes on her would be skeptical, waiting for her to falter. But Evelyn Carter didn't falter. She never had. Back in the courtroom, Malcolm stood before the bench, his public defender, a young man named Ethan Walsh, shuffling papers beside him. Ethan was overworked, his caseload a crushing blur of names and charges, but he'd taken a moment to review Malcolm's file. Something about the case felt off. The officer's report was vague, the resisting charge flimsy. Ethan leaned toward Malcolm, whispering, "We'll push for dismissal if we can get the dashcam admitted." Malcolm nodded, his face unreadable. He wasn't counting on miracles, but he'd fight as long as he had breath. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the room. "All rise." Grayson's tone was sharp, relishing the command. The gallery stood, heads turning as the door behind the bench opened. Evelyn Carter stepped out, her presence commanding without effort. Her dark eyes swept the room, taking in every detail, the nervous defendants, the weary attorneys, the smug bailiff by the door. Grayson's smirk faded slightly, though he didn't know why. Something about the judge unsettled him, a gut instinct he couldn't place. Evelyn took her seat, her gavel resting lightly in her hand. "Be seated," she said, her voice steady, authoritative. The room settled, but the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. She opened the docket, her eyes scanning the first case. "State versus Malcolm Reed," she read, glancing up. Her gaze landed on Malcolm, and for a moment, her expression softened. She saw the shaved head, the military posture, the quiet strength in his eyes. She didn't know the story yet, but she knew men like him, survivors of battles both overseas and at home. Grayson shifted on his feet, his unease growing. He'd expected Judge Hargrove, the old white man who'd ruled this courtroom for decades, nodding along to whatever the prosecutor said. This new judge, this black woman, was an unknown variable. He didn't like unknowns. The prosecutor, a woman named Laura Bennett, stood to present the charges. Her voice was clipped, professional, as she outlined the state's case. Malcolm Reed, stopped for a broken taillight, had allegedly resisted arrest, creating a public disturbance. She requested bail be set at $5,000, citing Malcolm's combative behavior. Ethan rose to counter, his argument measured but firm. "Your Honor, my client has no criminal history, served honorably in the military, and poses no flight risk. The charges are based on a single officer's account, and we have reason to believe the dashcam footage contradicts it. We request release on his own recognizance." Evelyn listened, her pen moving across her notes. She glanced at Malcolm again, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his appearance. The shaved head stood out, not a style choice, but something forced, unnatural. She'd seen it before in her days as a defender, jailhouse power, trips disguised as protocol. Her voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Reed, step forward." Malcolm complied, his movements precise, almost parade ground sharp. He stood before the bench, meeting Evelyn's gaze without flinching. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I notice your hair appears recently shaved. Can you tell me when and why that happened?" The question hung in the air, unexpected. Grayson stiffened, his arms uncrossing, one hand brushing nervously against his belt. Malcolm spoke, his voice calm but resonant. "This morning, ma'am. The bailiff, Mr. Grayson, said it was for hygiene. Took me to a room and shaved it himself." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ethan's head snapped toward Malcolm, his eyes wide. He hadn't known. Laura Bennett frowned, sensing the case shifting under her feet. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her grip on the gavel tightened. "Is that so?" she said, her tone deceptively mild. She turned her gaze to Grayson. "Bailiff, step forward." Grayson hesitated, a fraction of a second too long, before moving to the center of the room. His face was a mask of forced neutrality, but sweat beaded at his temples. "Your Honor," he started, "it's standard procedure for inmates to—" Evelyn raised a hand, silencing him. "Standard procedure," she repeated, her voice cutting like a blade. "Yet I see other defendants in this courtroom with their hair intact." Why was Mr. Reed singled out? Grayson's mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't expected to be questioned. Not like this. I, deemed it necessary, Your Honor. For hygiene, like I said. Evelyn's eyes bore into him, unyielding. Hygiene, she echoed. Mr. Grayson, are you aware that forcing a haircut on a defendant without clear, documented justification can constitute an abuse of authority? Or that targeting an individual based on appearance, or, say, race, violates both policy and law? The courtroom went silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Grayson's face flushed, his hands clenching at his sides. I wasn't targeting nobody, Your Honor. It was just... Enough, Evelyn said, her voice low but final. She turned to the clerk. I want a full report on courthouse intake procedures, including any documented cases of forced haircuts, by end of day. She looked back at Malcolm. Mr. Reed, you have my apologies for what you've endured. This court will not tolerate such conduct. Malcolm nodded, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. He'd seen justice promised before, only to watch it slip away. But this felt different. This judge saw him, not as a case number, but as a man. Evelyn turned to the prosecutor. Ms. Bennett, I'm inclined to release Mr. Reed on his own recognizance pending review of the dashcam footage. Do you have any objection? Laura hesitated, glancing at her notes, then shook her head. No, Your Honor. She knew the case was unraveling, and pushing back now would only weaken her position. Very well, Evelyn said. Mr. Reed, you're released on your own recognizance. The court will reconvene in 1 week to review the evidence. You're free to go. Malcolm exhaled, a small release of tension, and stepped back. Ethan clapped him on the shoulder, a rare smile breaking through his fatigue. The gallery buzzed, the retirees whispering to each other, the reporters scribbling furiously. Grayson stood rooted to the spot, his face a mix of anger and fear. He'd been untouchable for years, his authority unquestioned. Now, in a single morning, a black woman on the bench had dismantled that illusion. As Malcolm was led back to the holding area to be processed out, Evelyn called the next case, her voice steady, her focus unshaken. But her mind lingered on Grayson. She'd seen men like him before, small men wielding power like a club, secure until someone stronger called their bluff. She'd meant what she said about the report, and she'd follow through. If Grayson's actions were part of a pattern, he wouldn't be a bailiff much longer. For Malcolm, the walk back to the holding cell felt lighter, though the handcuffs still bit his wrists. He'd lost his hair, his freedom, his dignity, at least for a moment, but he'd gained something too. A spark of hope, kindled by a judge who saw him, who fought for him. He didn't know what the next week would bring, whether the dashcam would clear him, or if the system would find another way to grind him down. But for now, he held his head high, his shaved scalp a badge of survival, not shame. Grayson, meanwhile, lingered in the courtroom, his eyes fixed on the bench. He felt the stares, the other deputies avoiding his gaze, the clerk's disapproval like a weight. He'd underestimated Malcolm, underestimated the new judge. He'd thought he was in control, that his world was his to rule. But Evelyn's words echoed in his mind, her authority of force he couldn't bully or bluff. For the first time in years, Carl Grayson felt small. The day wore on, cases piling up, but the morning's confrontation lingered in the courthouse air. Word spread, as it always does, through clerks and coffee shops, from the reporter's story to the town's barbershops. A black veteran had been wronged, but a black woman judge had answered. Justice wasn't guaranteed. Malcolm's fight wasn't over, and Evelyn's tenure would face more battles, but for one fleeting moment, the system bent toward fairness. And in that small-town courthouse in Jefferson County, that moment was enough.